So I give the floor to Mr. Scott Foster, who is the Director of Sustainable Energy Division in the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. Scott.
Thank you, Arturos. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here to speak on behalf of UNECE. Being the last panelist, I have the huge advantage of only endorsing what has been said by the panelists who went before me. So I'll just make a few additional remarks. In the UNECE region, which covers most of the Northern Hemisphere, we have an ongoing conversation and a dialogue about what is meant by sustainable energy. On the one hand, we're very focused on decarbonizing the energy sector, really addressing the challenge, the serious challenge that we face with climate change. And on the other hand, there's a large number of countries who view sustainable energy as acquiring the energy that is needed for sustainable development. Those two are not completely separate, but they're not completely the same either. And we heard a reference to that this morning with the concept of the golden thread. So we're trying to find the pathway that allows us to reconcile those two agendas. One thing that needs to be mentioned is there is no plausible scenario in which fossil fuel does not play a significant role in the energy fuel mix. Some analysis says, and this is done by the IEA, that the 2-degree scenario that they've looked at still involves 40% of primary energy coming from fossil fuels. And that points to technology like carbon capture and storage being part of that equation. So in essence, I would say that all technologies have a role to play, and they've got to play the role to the best that they can. That means if we are going to have a competitive environment in which the technologies are competing for market share, that it has to be on a level playing field. So the whole issue of subsidies and support for different technologies has to be sorted out. Now, last year, all 5 of the regional commissions of the UN gathered together in Hammamet in Tunisia, and our executive secretaries signed a joint declaration, what we call the Hammamet Declaration. And you can find that on our website. And it really lays out a set of recipes for how the different regions can move forward with attaining sustainable energy. And I could read you the whole document. It's about 10 pages. I won't do that to you. In essence, it really means let's try to find a way to have rational economics underpinning policies. It does mean removing subsidies from top to bottom and trying to make the whole system more efficient. Now, I'd like to reinforce several of the messages that Paolo has already referred to. In the world that we're moving into, there's got to be a proper way to value flexibility. The current market structures don't value flexibility properly, whether you're talking about balancing markets or some other approach. If you were to value flexibility properly, gas would have an even more important role to play because of the energy services that it can provide to the network. So there's a certain complementarity that naturally enhances the role that gas could play. Even more important, countries that do have balancing markets tend to do it on a national basis. And that's actually pretty inefficient. If you did it on an overall regional basis, you could achieve a lot more with valuing flexibility. Last time I looked, the sun does rise in the east and does set in the west. So the change in peaks of demand that occur, the change in how the renewables production is occurring would be much more advantageous and really enhance the uptake of renewables if you could sort out more regional markets. I would like to point out as well that specifically on gas and on renewables and the energy system in Europe, if we were able to create a very broad regional system, creating a mutually beneficial interdependence would really enhance resolving some of the challenges that we face today. Finally, I would like to point to the idea of energy services, and Paolo mentioned it very briefly, and it was also mentioned a moment ago. You and I are not consuming kilowatt hours right now. We're consuming lighting, we're consuming ventilation. The result is that in energy markets today, we do not have markets that work. I'm the utility and I'm sending you a bill for kilowatt hours and you're paying that bill. But what you're consuming is lighting and ventilating and cooling. If we could sort that out, which really means reinventing what energy is, then we could go a long way to resolving a lot of these issues. That also involves how do you market and commercialize green energy to the final consumer. The issues for renewables are often how do you access the network? How do you access the customer? It's not about the pricing only, it's much more than that. So if I think about reinventing energy, I've just talked about the downstream. I've actually already talked about the upstream with value and flexibility, and likewise you have things in between, which is how the transmission and distribution systems are working. So when we think about business models for how do we enhance the uptake of renewable energy, I think we've got to fundamentally rethink what energy is and how we can get there from where we are. Now, a very critical issue is investment framework conditions. They've got to be consistent, they've got to be persistent, and they've got to achieve the objectives that you want them to achieve. If we have standards and if we have best practices out there, industry will be prepared to make the investments without fear of having the rug pulled out from under their investments. We've got to engage with industry, we've got to engage with the private sector, we've got to engage with the public. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Scott.